Welcome to today's seminar in our series on I Can't Believe It's Not Better. We try to make science in machine learning a little bit more than just who has the boldest number in the table. And we are very lucky to have today Finale Doshi-Velez with us. She's a professor at computer science at Harvard, does a lot of work in different areas. And today, the area we are most interested in is interactive machine learning. So thank you again, Finale, for being with us. And I hope that everybody else enjoys today's talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And just to repeat what Manuel said, I would love to have interruptions during the talk. If this becomes a discussion, that's fantastic. Really, my goal for today is to give a very informal, but what I think is an important presentation on first how to think about interpretable machine learning as science, as research, and what are the important questions there, and also how to go about doing it, because I think that interpretable machine learning is a little different than many other parts of machine learning because it's inherently interdisciplinary. The whole goal with interpretability is to make your model somehow accessible to a human being. And so it's not an area that we're as familiar with. And sometimes it can feel a little squishy, right? It's like, oh, humans, they're like, they're soft. And but there's actually very rigorous ways to pursue research in this area. And my goal is really to help us think about what that looks like. All right. So as I said, the first thing that I would like to do is just lay out, what is interpretable machine learning? How should we be thinking about the interpretable machine learning ecosystem? So in terms of what is it? So in terms of defining it, definition, I'm going to define it pretty broadly, that interpretable machine learning is ML that involves giving information, probably about a model, about a model to a person or to people to inform decisions of some kind, right? And it could be that initially we are just increasing a level of knowledge or something like that, but there is some purpose for which the information is necessary. So how does that fit in with the usual way we think about machine learning? So in the general setting, there's usually some input that we have for a machine learning system. It goes into some model, right? Out comes some output from the model. And this could be a standard supervised setting. In the unsupervised setting, maybe this is the representation or something that comes out. But for now, we can just treat it as input, model, output. And the way that we choose what's a good model is we have some form of machine learning loss that is trying to be optimized, right? So the output goes into the machine learning loss. Out here, there was an environment, there was some context that produced the input and maybe produced something like a true output or some label, true target that we're aiming for, also goes into the machine learning loss. And that is our standard machine learning setting, right? We want our output to match some true output or target that we've specified. Or, this could be we want the output to reconstruct the inputs. Again, we're kind of dealing with this abstractly. So what happens in the interpretable machine learning setting? So in this case, the machine learning loss is some proxy, right? Usually, we might use a squared loss or whatever for convenience of optimization. But then the model, something needs to happen in the real world, right? So the model produces some type of explanation. We'll get to what that is in just a bit. The explanation gets passed to a human. The output of the model may also get passed to the human. The input of the model may also be available, like whatever information went there. And there might also be additional information from the context, right, that wasn't available to the model that also goes into the human being. Now the human being makes some decision. What treatment, a lot of my work has to do with healthcare applications. So we might think, what treatments are we going to give to patients? So some treatment, for example, is prescribed. And then there is some real world loss, right? So this is our human who outputs a decision. And then there's some real loss that happens out in the real world, depending on the outcome of that decision. And in real life, this is the loss that we care about, right? Not necessarily the loss that we trained our model against. This is true in general. But in the interpretable machine learning setting, the key thing that we're playing around with is, what is this piece over here, right? What is that explanation that we're going to be passing on to the human to help make a better decision? And why might we want that explanation, right? Why might we want that? Well, there might be situations where just saying that, I recommend this drug isn't good enough. We might want to provide some context for that recommendation because we want the clinician to be able to connect that with other information that they already know about the patient, and maybe make an even better recommendation. We also might want the output to be mediated by an explanation because it might be a bad idea, right? And so this gets us to kind of two distinct reasons for the explanation, which are important to keep in mind when you're thinking about tasks and studies. So the first one that I mentioned was helping the human make an even better decision, right? And maybe just the output alone doesn't help you do that. So this one I'm going to call insight, using some language from the HCI folks at Harvard. So the explanation might help provide some insight into the model working and make an even better decision. And the other purpose might be to catch errors. So call this one oversight. And these are two distinct reasons why we might want to be sending some information across. And so one of the themes today is going to be that there's going to be some parts of interpretable machine learning that are very computational, and there are some that are much more, they live in this broader socio-technical system. So when you're thinking about your experiments, you're thinking about the purpose of what things are doing. Let's start with the purpose of what's going on. And then there's also, what does the explanation look like? So what is the explanation in terms of like form and content? And here there are there's two main types of explanation. I'm going to be using terminology in a way that's maybe slightly different than most of the literature. And I think one of the things with interpretable machine learning is that our field is still settling on terminology. So I'll try to define terms as I go. And if there's any confusion, definitely jump in. So what is the explanation? So one approach is that the explanation can be the model. So for example, if the model is relatively simple, let's suppose that it's a decision tree or some such, then you can just send the model across. So these are inherently interpretable, I think is the term that, well, at least I use and I think people are settling around. And these don't have to be as simple as decision trees. So for example, in our lab, we come up with different types of hierarchical models that are extremely inspectable, right? But are still fairly expressive. And the idea here is that maybe you can't stare at the whole model all at once, but it might take a page and a half of like, here's a module here, and here's a module here. Here's a topic, here's a state. And once you spend some time understanding each piece, and also we tell you how the pieces fit together, you can still understand the whole thing. Given enough time, you can understand the whole thing. And that would still be an example of an inherently interpretable model. And in high stakes situations, I I very much believe that this is kind of what you have to do, because it needs to be fully inspectable for you to be sure that it's going to work well. And then the explanation, another alternative could be that the explanation is a partial view of the model. So maybe the model is too complicated and you cannot look at I can't just give you the neural network and you would be able to make any sense of it. But I tell you something about it. So I'm sure everyone here has seen these saliency maps. So you have an image classifier, and then you have a map that tells you, oh, here are the pixels that were most important for making this decision. So that's an example of a partial view of the model, right? In that case, you're seeing the gradients of the output with respect to the input for a particular input point, right? And it's not like that is true or false. It just is. It's just a computation that you've done on the model. And the way I really like to think about this explanation as a partial view when you have to do that is an explanation is just a statistic of the model, maybe computed at a particular spot, right? So think of this as a statistic of the model. And again, I think that's an important way to think about it, because that kind of, again, there's been a lot of talk in the interpretable machine learning world about misleading and biased and non-sensitive and et cetera explanations. And I think if we think about them as just, these are like test statistics, right? They're just numbers that you calculate based off of your model. Then it kind of, we can go into math land, right? And we can think critically about what these numbers actually mean. What can we expect from a test statistic? If we run a z-test on non-Gaussian data, it will not work, right? And it's not like the z-test is trying to be misleading or something like that. It was just the wrong statistic, the wrong test to run. And likewise in interpretable machine learning, if you're trying to get certain types of information out of your model, then certain test statistics might not give you that information, right? So there's two kind of ways we might go about doing this. And the second approach, I would say, is especially necessary, or when is it necessary? When the inputs are not interpretable themselves. And what I mean by that is that in situations where the inputs have inherent meaning, so most of my work is with structured data from electronic health records. So a code, for example, that says patient has major depression. That's a meaningful code. Like all by itself, that dimension, it makes sense. Whereas a particular amplitude in a waveform or a pixel in an image, just on its own, that doesn't really carry much semantic meaning. And so that's where things get a little bit difficult, right? It's hard to build anything inherently interpretable when the inputs themselves are not inherently interpretable. And it's also the place where we see the most deep learning successes, that these more complicated models have had the most success on these sorts of data inputs that are waveforms, images, speech, etc. So there we go. There's a really brief overview of the machine learning or interpretable machine learning ecosystem in black, why we might want the explanation in red, and what the explanation might be in terms of how this ecosystem works. So now what I want to do is focus on two distinct parts of this picture. So the first part is this part over here, which is how does the model become the explanation? So in terms of the talk, I'm going to spend some time talking about this. And then the second part that I want to spend some time on is this part of the explanation, the human, and the decision, right? Like how does this whole messy piece work? Because for interpretable machine learning to be successful overall, you need both of these pieces, right? The model needs to spit out the right information. People need to use it in the right way. On the other hand, as researchers, we know that like abstractions are critical, right? And we want to find that really specific problem to be solving. And so thinking about kind of what happens when the model produces the explanation versus how do people interact with the explanation, I find is a really useful way to separate how to do research in interpretable machine learning and being really clear about where your research is. So let us start with that first part, right? It's about how does how does this work in terms of model to explanation? Oh, okay. So so Melanie, you're asking, where do human in the loop approaches fail? And I think that they can fail at both stages. So I think that's why it's important to think about both. And I'll talk about properties in a few moments that I think can help be that clue. But for example, just to give a high level of how failures can happen in both places, the explanation can fail in the second stage when given to a human if it just increases trust with no reason to increase trust. And there's been studies with just human beings, right? No model or anything, where just the presence of an explanation increases compliance. So there's this example that Adrian Weller loves to give, where he's like, you ask someone to use the copy machine, and there's like a long queue, you want to cut in line, and be like, no. And you're like, I need to use the copy machine to make a copy, and then more people will let you cut in line, even if that explanation gave no additional anything, right? It's just somehow the presence of an explanation can just increase over-reliance. And we've seen that some of this over-reliance as well. But you can also have situations where the model spits out an explanation that doesn't give the necessary information to make the decision. So there's, I think the saliency map example is a good one, where there's so many different ways to get those important pixels from an image. And they all look different, right? And which is the right one, right? Which is the one that's giving the information that the human needs to make the decision. And then there's also a question that says, what are the decisions that humans make with the explanation? Can we talk about explanation independent of decisions? And I believe that in the high level picture, the answer is no. Right? It's like kind of like saying, can you talk about building a model without defining a loss? An explanation is there to perform a particular task, and the quality of the explanation depends on how well it enables performance on the task. Now, that said, there's a lot of, and what I'm going to lay out now is that there's many steps in between, right? And so you could say that I'm improving this part of the explanation, or this part of the interpretable machine learning process, without necessarily involving humans or decisions. So I think it's a good question. And again, at a high level, I think this is an important thing for everyone to take away. It's like interpretable machine learning is inherently, an interdisciplinary endeavor that involves, working with humans to perform tasks. Okay. But we do have these two phases, right? We have a model to explanation phase, and then we have our explanation to human phase. So in that model to explanation phase, as we noted before, we have to choose the explanation type, which may be maybe the model type, if the model is meant to be the explanation, right? And we have to compute it. So we have to choose it. We have to compute that explanation. And this brings us to two types of computational questions, right, that don't involve humans at all. So the first part is how to optimize. Right? Like, how do you actually do this computation in a way that's stable and efficient and has all the machine learning properties that we want? And especially if the model is its own explanation, the types of models that are often most interpretable to people have discrete elements. It might be a decision tree, or it might be some other form of logic that's layered on top of some topic model or mixture model or something like this. But many times these inherently interpretable models involve some sort of mixture of discrete and continuous elements. And there's a question of how to do that optimization effectively. And if your research is to do that optimization in a way that finds the global optima, or that can find the space of possible reasonable optima for that problem, then that doesn't need people, right? That's kind of back to kind of core machine learning type of bread and butter that we do on a daily basis. So this doesn't need humans, right? We just need to justify, why this particular model is worth optimizing. But fortunately, there's been more and more work, on human side of things, saying that, oh, people can use these sort of things, that we kind of know what we might need to optimize. And then in terms of choosing the type of explanation, and this is something I'm still playing around with. So this is this talk represents kind of my thinking in progress, which has definitely changed over the last several years that I've been working in this field. But I believe that there is a abstraction here, which is what properties does an explanation need? And so you can imagine that you're working in a certain domain. One easy way to think about it is like false positives and false negatives. So there's a question that is like, how do we verify the accuracy of these explanations? And is confirmation bias an issue? So I'm going to separate, I think those are two somewhat different questions. So I'm going to answer them separately. So we can verify the accuracy of the explanations by exactly what I'm going to get at. What is the, that could be one property that you want out of your explanation. And the nice thing about explanations is that, especially if we have access to the model, we can check, right, various types of consistency of the explanation to the model. And then confirmation bias lies on the other side. So like accuracy is part one. Confirmation bias is an example of an issue that happens in the second phase, in part two. So what properties does an explanation need? So one property that was just pointed out, by the way, folks are welcome, like putting stuff in the chat is great. If I answer a question partially in the chat and you have follow on, also you're very welcome to just interrupt and you can interrupt live, okay. So actually, instead of framing it as accuracy, I'm going to start out splitting up accuracy a little bit more. So there's notions of compactness that say that there's nothing extra in the explanation. So let's suppose that your explanation are, as a running example, like what are the features of a patient that are driving the decision to give a particular medicine. If you give an explanation that says that it's these 5 features, have you included an extra feature? Was it really 4 features that drove the decision? But because of the way you compute your test statistic, you actually end up producing 5, right? So you can think of it as false positives. So does your explanation produce false positives? And you might think that in certain situations, that's really problematic, right? You don't want to produce reasons that are not actually reasons. Okay, the flip side of that is completeness, which is nothing left out. That says you don't want any false negatives in your explanation. That if you say that these are the 5 reasons that I'm recommending this drug, there isn't a 6th reason with respect to the model that for some reason, again, your partial view, your test statistic has not exposed. There's notions of and when you put these two together, you get notions of fidelity or faithfulness. So this is basically both kind of complete and compact. But we can have other sorts of properties as well. For example, we might need things to be sparse or short somehow. Like if the explanation is going to have to be used in a time-limited circumstance, maybe there's just limited information that we can pass along. And that might be in tension with having something that's complete, right? Because we might have to leave things out to make it short enough. And remember, an explanation could be just a partial view. So it's okay if it's partial, but we need to understand in what ways it is partial, right? That's kind of where the rigor comes in, and understanding the quality of an explanation. So it might need to be sparse or short. You might want it to be stable, which means that it's similar for nearby points. And you might be thinking to yourself correctly, how can the explanation be stable if the model is not stable, right? That if you have a model that looks like this, then of course the explanation of like kind of how to cross the boundary here is going to look very different than like how to cross the boundary here. Like what's the feature that would take me over the boundary? So there's going to be some limitations, obviously, that come from the form of the model itself. And one thing that might push back in terms of properties into model design might be like, well, okay, this is a faithful description of this funny curve that I wrote, that it's true that at this point and this point, which look really close to each other, the fastest way to cross the boundary is different. And that's just how it is. But if we say that, well, humans kind of have a length scale that looks like this, where they perceive these points as basically indistinguishable from each other. And therefore, it causes a dissonance when the explanations are different. They would expect the same sort of pattern for both of them. Then maybe you have to go back to your model and see whether a smoother model might still perform well, right? And this might be a trade-off that you have to make. And then the final property that I'm going to name here is called translucence, which it has been used to say like kind of knowing its limitations. And I think this is one that's less talked about, but one that I really would encourage people in the field to think about, which is what are the properties that are that this explanation has, and what are the properties that it doesn't have. So we're doing some work currently in the lab that just help expose like how stable is an explanation. And if I tell you that these features are really important for this patient, and I also tell you, but if you change the patient, just slightly, then I would give you a completely different explanation. You might trust the explanation differently. You might see there's something wonky either with the explanation or the model, but I need to be careful interpreting the information that is coming up. But again, all of these things that I've listed, I want to emphasize that all of the stuff so far, this is all computational. So in terms of doing interpretable machine learning research, there's a key segment of work that is, again, like it's kind of squarely computational. It's the sort of thing that we're all kind of maybe used to doing. And if you are a reviewer on an interpretable machine learning paper, for example, if someone was trying to compute properties on an explanation or trying to optimize an interpretable model or such, you wouldn't ask for a user study, right? You don't really need a user study to answer these sorts of questions. You only need to be able to, check these properties. These are things that you would probably be proving, right? That here's a proof that says that this explanation has this property, or here's a metric that will measure this property. Cool. So that's the model to explanation part, right? And the kind of things that you can do to be rigorous kind of at this stage.
Before we go on, we have one more question in the chat on the nearbyness of the explanation.
Oh, great point. Yes. So nearby is in an epsilon neighborhood or semantic shift. So yeah, so when I drew that ball, I was thinking of that as a semantically the same. Like for people, these are like indistinguishable. Like for a machine, they might be. And when you hit that situation, maybe you need to go back and educate the person, right? You might need to be like, well, these two things, you didn't have words for these two inputs being different, but you really should, right? And this is why, you know, it really is important. Or it might be that, hey, this model was just unnecessarily wiggly. And with some regularization, you could actually smooth it out and it would still perform just fine, maybe even better. And so that's a question that can't be answered until you kind of take a closer look at the data and the model. Good point. Okay, so then we have the part that is explanation plus human to decision. And for this part, I split it up into a couple of different questions or things that we need to think about, which is, first of all, like what properties are needed in the context, right? Properties. So this is what I alluded to before, like the computation of the properties or guaranteeing that an explanation has properties is a computational question. Whereas determining what properties are needed, that's a human factors question. And if we go back up here, there's going to be this mediating thing called properties. So the context is going to require some properties, and the properties is going to govern the shape of the explanation. Right? So this is kind of an extra bit that I'm playing around with, right? And as I said, my thinking about this is always evolving, but right now I'm playing around with the idea that the properties can help serve as that abstraction between providing the computational spec of what you need to do from the model to the explanation versus for the explanation to be successful to be used by the human. So what properties are needed in a context? I think another really important thing is that visualization and presentation, training, engagement make a huge difference in terms of how people interact with the explanation. And I'll give a couple of examples of this as you know, from our own research. So when I first started working in, or one of my earliest studies in interpretable machine learning, I was like thinking very much as a machine learning person because that's my background. This is where I'm coming from. And I thought, okay, well, if I am training, let's say a rule list of some kind or a decision set of some kind, what is the more important regularizer? Is it better to have a few long rules, and I could create some regularizers to create a model that's a few long rules, or is it better to have multiple short rules, right? Like, wear your sunscreen if it's hot above a certain temperature, or if the heat index is above certain thing, and blah blah blah, versus some long complicated expression, but relatively few of them. And again, I was thinking with a machine learning hat for this particular research question, because what I wanted at the end of the day, I wanted to be able to go back into my computational world and optimize these decision sets with the right criteria, right? I wanted to make sure that I had the right loss function to go back and optimize my decision set. So I was like, but I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to, I'm not just going to produce some arbitrary, loss function for this decision set learning. I'm going to get it from human beings. So we did a bunch of Turk studies just to try to see, do people process information better if it's like a few long things versus, many short things and everything in between. And we got some results. But honestly, like all of this is, as I've done more research in the field on the human factor side, it's really in the wash, right? It probably kind of one takeaway that I've come from in terms of my research in this area, and kind of in the spirit of the seminar series of like, what's it really like, is that, differences between models are pretty small versus compared to these other effects in terms of like how people are engaging and all of this. I'm going to expand on this. So when people are, and this is something just to keep in mind if you are happening to do research in this field, or if you happen to read research in this field, that when someone does a user study comparing like model A versus model B, or explanation 1 versus explanation 2, the factors surrounding that study design and how the presentation, blah, 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 all of these things were done, are probably dominating the results much more than those specific small changes. And if you really are interested in those small changes, first of all, think like, why are you interested in the small changes, right? Like if the effect size is relatively small between different models, is that where we should be focusing when we're trying to optimize like interpretable machine learning methods versus, for example, a question that we're now thinking of, which is a much better question, is how do we get people to engage with the explanation, right? And that's also a machine learning type of problem, but a different type of machine learning problem, because now there might be the big decision-making problem, which is, what treatment to recommend. But there's a small decision-making problem of which form of nudge or information is going to cause someone to actually read this, the thing that I'm presenting to them, because the dominating effect is not, the exact form of what I give you to read, but whether or not you properly read it at all. And that becomes its own type of problem. So let me start there actually as an example in terms of how these different things have an effect. So this engagement issue. And there's a couple of different ways that we could think about this, but I'm just going to tell like 2 stories to make this concrete. So the first one is a study done by Zana, who is an HCI student, Zana and collaborators, who is an HCI student. So I was not involved, but I think it's a really cool study out of Harvard. And in this study, one of their key points was that they did some work that involved asking someone to, you have your model, you have your information, and they asked them about the model. And they measured, how well people were understanding the explanation. Like if you give an explanation with top 5 factors, and then your kind of quiz question is like, what's the most important factor, right? You're testing people's ability to understand the explanation, and then you ask them to make a decision. Alternatively, you could ask them to just make the decision, right? You don't specifically ask them to attend to the explanation. So you might have a situation where like here's your screen, there's like a recommendation, there's an explanation, and now the user has to like pick a button, like make a decision to make. And if prior to making the decision, if the user has to answer a question about the explanation or something like that, that they've had to read it, they've had to grok what's going on in there. Whereas if you just ask them to make a decision, they can kind of skim over it, right? And they might not fully go through what was there. And what they found is that the results were really different. The study had many parts, but the part that I think is most relevant for us, or kind of key point here, is that when you have a proxy task, and this happens a lot in the interpretable machine learning literature, where we would say, well, I want to just, I want to evaluate this explanation in the abstract, right? I want to see if I give you that long list versus that tall list, can you answer questions like, will this feature make a difference faster with the tall list or the long list, right? And therefore, if you can answer questions, more effectively with the long one, then maybe the long one's better, right? But in real life, no one's going to be saying, oh, if you change this feature, does that have an impact on the output? In real life, usually people are going to be saying, okay, so what treatment do we give the patient, right? You're not going to be asking questions like, are we going to muck around with these? And so kind of one key point here is that people may not fully engage with the explanation if they don't have to, because it's cognitive labor. It's extra work. And we've done some work as well. This is work involving Melanie as well, where we presented made up studies of potential patients and potential treatment recommendations. And in one of the versions of the study, we gave a logic-based explanation, which was kind of long and honestly a little bit annoying to work with. And in another version, people had a feature-based explanation. So the feature explanation would just say, recommend this drug because patient has A, B, and C, versus the logic explanation would say something like, recommend this drug because, well, this drug interacts with this part of the patient's condition. When patients have this type of condition, this sort of thing is warranted. And there was like a couple of steps of logic that went into that particular reasoning, right? We were providing some actual reasoning versus like A, B, and C are the key factors. And what we found in that particular study was that people liked the short explanations a lot better. However, they performed worse. So what we did in this study is we purposefully manipulated in terms of insight and oversight. This was more of an oversight sort of situation where we purposely made the recommendations wrong in certain circumstances, and we were checking to see if people would still kind of over-rely and follow the recommendation. And we were hoping that the explanation would mitigate that, right? Like if you have an explanation, then maybe you realize that, oh, wait, like this recommendation makes no sense. And what we found, again, is that people dislike the longer explanation, but perform better with it. So there's, again, this tension in terms of, how people engage, the amount of cognitive labor that they want to put in. And this creates another really interesting machine learning question, interpretable machine learning question, human+AI machine learning question, which is like, how do you request the right amount of engagement at the right time? Because if your model is really short and you know exactly what needs to be done, then maybe it's fine if the human kind of over relies on the model. It's totally fine. Whereas if you believe that your model might be imperfect, that it needs some oversight for this particular output, then maybe you need a strategy that's going to make sure that the human will engage with the model and the information. And there might be also situations where you just know your model is wrong, right? And then there's no point in providing any recommendation or explanation at all, because you just don't want to, you just want to tell the user, hey, can't do anything. And so this is how like there's areas of interpretable machine learning that touch very closely on, again, very well-trod areas of machine learning, for example, uncertainty quantification and these sorts of things. Cool. So those are kind of the high level of this area. I'm going to say one thing to kind of bring these two pieces together, and then I'm going to pause and check in terms of whether people have questions. Right. I could also talk a bit about like kind of our experience with like user study design and how, you know, so that's something that I had to learn, at least. It wasn't something that I knew how to do. But before I open up to that, I just want to leave with kind of what is the grand challenge in interpretable machine learning is really figuring out like what explanation for what contexts, right? Different explanations are needed in different contexts. And I'm assuming the context kind of includes a real world task. And my hypothesis is that we can separate this into what properties for what context and what explanations for what properties. Again, this is kind of like work in progress that I'm thinking through. So with that as the high level and me chatting about kind of each of these pieces in a little bit of detail, I should have also said, okay, all of this stuff here clearly requires user studies, right? We can't explore any of these things without a user study, and we need to do a user study to make claims about any of these things. So I'll pause. Like, any questions that people want to ask, I'm happy to kind of turn it more towards answering questions. Or if there aren't too many questions, I'm happy to chat about user study design. Yeah, Melanie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Finale. I'm curious, I guess it seems that it's so important to understand the psychology of humans, basically to make sure that we are designing the explanations and also, yeah, our explanations for clinicians, our explanations for machine learning researchers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, like, what's the status of, you know, psychology plus machine learning and how, I mean, should we be looking more into the field and how is that evolving in your eyes?
Yeah, I think this is another piece of that grand challenge, maybe, or another set of properties, which is maybe like properties is maybe my word for like embeddings in this space of where I think there's a way to embed the context, there's a way to embed the user, because I think, for example, one key difference in terms of what sort of explanation you need is this like a ex ante, like I'm going to inspect the model, like I'm not in a rush, right? So when you're trying to debug or something as a researcher, you're not in a rush, right? You can spend half an hour staring at output. I'm sure all of us do. Whereas if you have a patient in front of you, that's very different. So that might be an example of a contextual property that governs types of explanations. And, you know, I could hypothesize that the type of, that's the driving factor. It doesn't matter whether it's a machine learning researcher or a clinician, you know, whether they have time is one of the key elements of the type of explanation you need. Now, that said, actually one study that I didn't mention, so recently we did a study with judges where we presented them with explanations for bail decisions, for pretrial release recommendations. And we thought we made it very, very clear that we were presenting counterfactuals of, like, you know, if the defendant were a difference, then the recommendation would be different. And this is exposing something about the model, right? That if you have a defendant where small changes to the defendant would drastically change the risk recommendation, then maybe you scratch your head and are like, hey, this model's a little weird, right? I mean, the whole thing is a little weird, right? Let's just be clear in terms of using algorithmic tools for pretrial risk assessment, but extra weird. And it was completely counterintuitive. And we think it's partly due to their legal training, where they really think concretely about the defendant. So if you give them an alternative defendant, you're like, well, if the defendant had been a year older, the recommendation would have changed. And they're like, but there aren't a year older. Why are you telling me about this, right? It didn't happen. And that was really interesting, because I thought that this idea of counterfactuals would just be kind of what would flow across all different fields, but apparently it doesn't. Yeah.
Yes, cognition of human beings. No, it's like yeah, for us, like that counterfactual is completely useless. No, but yeah, like
how we're trained, right? I think this study could have worked if we did significantly more training, because I think what we were butting up against is a particular type of legal training. So they were taught to think in a particular way, and we were asking them to think in a way that was kind of opposite to that way that they had been taught to think. I think there's a raised hand.
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, regarding your study where you said that sometimes explanations might actually reduce the performance if people don't engage with them enough. Like, do you think there's specific situations in which you would actually recommend to not have any explanatory model just to avoid that? Or would you say, like, there should always be some way to make the users engage more and improve their performance?
Well, I think this comes down to, yeah, figuring out when do you demand that cognitive labor from a human, when and how. So if you're sure that you're right, maybe you don't. You know, like that drug interaction is a problem. You know, it is known to increase risk of heart attack. You don't need to explain it. You just say, don't do it. Whereas a situation where you don't know anything, you just don't present an output. But I think there's a middle ground where you're not sure. You think this recommendation might be useful, but providing some context might help. But for example, like asking people to answer a question about the explanation might be really annoying, but it might force them to think analytically about the information being presented. Another sort of thing you can do is you can ask people to come to a decision first, then present the additional information and ask them whether the additional information causes their opinion to change. And this is also like a strategy to force reflection, because now they have to answer the question of why their reasoning did or did not change. So the cognitive scientists and the HCI folks have all of these sorts of strategies. And I think as machine learning people, maybe our question can be, can we learn which strategy to use when? Because there's a little RL problem that I'm really excited about in trying to figure out which strategies to employ at which time.
Also, maybe as a follow-up, like, are there studies on how often people change their mind if you give them the explanation afterwards? Because I would guess that people are maybe less likely to change their mind after they've already made a decision.
So there is an anchoring bias, and so wherever you anchor is where you want to stay. That's for sure. I think it depends. Like in some of our studies, we see certain levels of change rates. Sometimes it sticks. It's not something, yeah, I haven't paid close enough attention to say something global about that. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, one thing I'll just leave with is that hopefully this helps kind of separate different questions within interpretable machine learning into like different research areas and what we should be looking for in each of these research areas. I didn't talk at all about the user study design part. That was the part that I didn't end up getting to. But if you are working in interpretable machine learning, I really highly recommend that you spend some time with social scientists or HCI folks or people who just know how to do their Latin squares and their stratified sampling and their learning effects and block randomization and propensity score matching, as well as their multi-level hypothesis testing p-values. It's a very rigorous and well-studied area. It's just an area that we don't spend a lot of time with. And good experimental design is really critical because there's so many factors, as we're saying, like just the visualization can change how people interact with something. The ordering of whether they see something one after the other can change how people interact with something. So there's a lot of these factors. But the good news is that maybe it just takes you back to like high school science fair, right? When you had to find your independent variables and your dependent variables and you randomize various things. But it's just something that we need to return to.
So finally, there is another question in the chat. So Meg is asking, are explanations consistent when there is the data drift? For instance, when model is trained on specific data, with time the input to the model changes. How much does this affect explainability? How does the field
That's a good question. So if the explanation was the model, then obviously you see the model doesn't change if the data underneath it changes. If your explanation is a statistic on the input, then of course the explanation is going to continue to now be a statistic on the new input that you're putting in that is very far away perhaps from where the model was trained. And perhaps that would help expose something is silly, right? Like you're so far away from where the model was being fit that you're in some exponential or linear regime that's like kind of way out from the rest of your model's behavior. So I don't think it affects explainability per se, but like explanations might help expose that the model is not necessarily applicable, like is relying on silly factors or something like that.
Are there any further questions from anybody? Right. Does not look like it. The talk was too self-explanatory, apparently. Yeah, then let me thank Vinale again for this great introduction and overview to interpretability. And also a quick information and reminder for everybody, our next seminar will be on July 7th. We will have Professor Thomas Dieterich as a guest who will be talking about novelty detection. Have a great day and a great weekend, and hopefully see all of you again in a couple of weeks.
Cool.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again, Vinale. See you.